All right, let's dive into one of modern history's biggest puzzles, the Vietnam War. It's this incredible story of contradictions, you know? It really challenges everything we think we know about what power means and how wars are fought. So let's start piecing this thing together.
And really, the whole puzzle boils down to this one single massive question. How on earth did a military and technological giant, the United States, fail to defeat a nationalist movement in a small Southeast Asian country? Figuring that out is exactly what we're going to do today.
Now, to help us get our heads around this, we're going to be looking at it through the eyes of historian Eric Hobsbawm. His whole argument is that to really get Vietnam, you have to see it as more than just a simple clash between communism and capitalism. For him, it was the final act in a long, brutal struggle for national liberation. And trust me, that perspective, it changes everything. Okay, so to really understand the American War, we have to go back, way back. See, this story doesn't kick off in the 1960s. Nope. It starts decades earlier with Vietnam's long and bloody fight for freedom against a totally different global power. So, for almost 100 years, Vietnam was a French colony. And all that time, the exploitation and oppression, it just lit this fuse of nationalist resistance. This is where leaders like Ho Chi Minh come onto the scene, dedicating their entire lives to getting an independent Vietnam. This whole struggle eventually just explodes into what we call the First Indochina War, which, believe it or not, ends with a shocking Vietnamese victory over the French at a place called Dien Bien Phu in 1954. So after that war, the big world powers get together and the Geneva Accords lay out what seems like a pretty simple plan. Temporarily split the country in two, right at the 17th parallel, and then hold nationwide elections to make it one country again. But here's the thing. Those elections, they never actually happened. Why? Well, mostly because the U.S. was terrified Ho Chi Minh would win in a landslide. And why was the U.S. so freaked out about that election? Well, it all came down to this one really powerful idea they had called the domino theory. This was like the central pillar of American foreign policy back then. Washington was absolutely convinced that if Vietnam became communist, it would start a chain reaction and boom, 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 all of Southeast Asia would fall, just like a row of dominoes. And this is where Hobsbawm's analysis just clicks right into place. He argues that by stopping those elections from happening, the U.S. basically denied Vietnam its right to choose its own destiny. That one act, more than maybe anything else, is what planted the seeds for the much bigger, much more brutal war that was just around the corner. So, with the country split in two and the promise of unity completely broken, the stage was set for round two, the Second Indochina War, or as most Americans just call it, the Vietnam War. But this was not going to be some ordinary conflict. It was a clash of total opposites, like a technological giant trying to fight a ghost it couldn't even see. Now, U.S. involvement didn't just happen overnight. It was a slow burn. It started with just a handful of advisors in the late 50s. Then, in the mid-60s, it just exploded into a full-blown escalation with hundreds of thousands of combat troops. By the end of the 60s, the strategy shifted to something called Vietnamization, basically training South Vietnamese forces to do the fighting, which eventually led to the final American pullout in 1973. And this contrast, it just lays out the fundamental problem of the war. You have the U.S. fighting to contain communism, using conventional armies and the most advanced technology on the planet. And on the other side, you have North Vietnam fighting for national liberation, using guerrilla tactics, and drawing its strength directly from the people and the land itself. Their motivations, their strategies, they were from two different planets. And if you want the perfect illustration of how this all played out, look no further than the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This thing wasn't just a road. Oh no. It was this unbelievably complex web of paths and tunnels and hidden supply lines that snaked through the dense jungles of Laos and Cambodia. America's high-tech bombers just couldn't kill it. It was the ultimate proof that sometimes geography and sheer human ingenuity can beat a superpower's technology. For years, the American public kept hearing the same message. We're making progress, the war is being won. But then, in 1968, a single, massive, coordinated attack completely shattered that story. This was the real turning point, the moment the illusion of an easy victory just vanished into thin air. That attack was the Tet Offensive. It was this huge surprise assault by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces all across South Vietnam. Now, here's the crazy part. From a purely military perspective, it was a disaster for them. They took unbelievable casualties. They didn't hold any ground. But psychologically, it was a stunning victory. because it proved that after years of war and all these optimistic reports, literally nowhere in South Vietnam was safe. And as Hobsbawm puts it, Tet just ripped the curtain back on the whole illusion. It exposed this giant gap between what American leaders were saying and what was really happening on the ground. The war wasn't almost over. In fact, it looked like it might never end. And right after Tet, public support for the war back in the US absolutely cratered, and the political will to keep fighting just started to crumble. So the fall of Saigon in 1975 officially ended the war. But its impact, its ghost, well, we still feel that today. And understanding the consequences is so important for understanding not just modern Vietnam, but also America's place in the world ever since. For the United States, the costs were just staggering. The war created these deep, painful divisions at home. It really damaged America's moral standing in the world, and it completely shattered the myth that its military was invincible. It was a really painful lesson about the limits of power. So, when you boil it all down, looking at it through that Hobsbawm lens, you get to this one powerful conclusion. The Vietnam War proved that a determined nationalist movement, one that's fueled by popular support and an almost superhuman willingness to endure, could actually beat a military superpower that just didn't have that same connection to the people. And that leaves us with a pretty big thought to chew on, right? In a world where we still often think about conflicts as just a contest of firepower and technology, the story of Vietnam makes us stop and ask a really tough question. What is real power? And is military might always the thing that decides who wins?